Bumblebee never lost his voice, which means he was there to say the one thing that changed everything, and the war that followed was never the same war it would have been. The night Soundwave came for him was the 14th of a stretch of bad nights. The kind of nights the Autobots did not discuss in briefings, but carried in the set of their shoulder armor and the slowness of their step when they thought no one was watching. Bumblebee had been running a surveillance sweep along the eastern perimeter, 3 miles from the highway overpass where Decepticon ground communications had been routing their traffic for 6 weeks, and he had found something in those frequencies that made every sensor in his chassis register at once, the internal equivalent of a breath held and not released. The transmissions were not tactical, they were strategic. They named names. They named coordinates. They named a timeline with 31 days remaining before it became something that could not be undone, and Bumblebee had been crouched behind the corroded skeleton of a decommissioned water treatment facility for 42 minutes recording every last word when Soundwave emerged from the dark like a signal that had been waiting to find its receiver. The thing about Soundwave, the thing that made him genuinely dangerous in a way the other Decepticons were not, was the precision. Starscream attacked out of ambition. Megatron attacked out of will. Soundwave attacked out of information, and his information was always better, always one step ahead, always already calibrated to the exact point of vulnerability before the target had identified the vulnerability themselves. The pulse he sent at Bumblebee that night was aimed at a single point, the Scout's vocal processor, a surgical strike that would leave him functional, intact, capable of continuing to operate, but permanently and completely mute. Because Soundwave had understood something the other Decepticons had not bothered to calculate. That a Bumblebee who could not speak was a manageable problem, a Scout reduced to radio playback and signal intercept, capable but contained, and a Bumblebee who could speak was something else entirely. The voice was the threat. The voice had to go. The wall crumbled at exactly the wrong moment for Soundwave's mathematics. Or perhaps at exactly the right moment for everything else that followed, though it would be years before anyone outside the two of them understood what had turned on that single instant. A section of corroded water tank gave way under 3 days of accumulated rain and 17 months of rust, the groan of it happening in the half-second before the pulse fired, and Bumblebee dropped 2 feet to the left as the shot burned past his antenna. A ray, close enough to strip paint from the base of his left audio sensor, close enough that he felt the heat signature register in his proximity alerts, and then he was moving. He was very good at moving. He had been built for exactly this, small and fast and capable of threading through urban terrain that made larger Autobots choose alternate routes, his chassis designed for the specific problems of a Scout who needed to be somewhere quickly, and then somewhere else before the somewhere he had just left registered his departure. He broadcast a single compressed signal to Optimus Prime as he ran, 3 seconds of dense encrypted information, the kind that did not request backup but simply stated, "I have something, I am intact. Do not respond," and Soundwave, tracking the frequency, registered the undamaged vocal processor, and registered what it meant for everything the Scout had just heard, and then sent a priority communication to Megatron that Bumblebee would not learn about for another 11 days. He made it back to base with every frequency intact. He stood in front of Optimus Prime in the early morning and spoke for 47 minutes without stopping, and when he finished, there was a silence in the room that was not the absence of things to say, but the presence of too many things to say at once. The immediate difference his intact voice made was not obvious to everyone, and to the Autobots who noticed it first, Optimus Prime and Ratchet neither said it aloud in those early weeks, because saying it aloud felt like it might unmake it. Bumblebee had always been effective. He had always been the Scout who returned with more than he had been sent to find, the one who read terrain and intention with a precision that made Ironhide, who had twice the combat history, watch him with something that was not quite respect and not quite unease but sat somewhere between them in the dark, waiting to resolve into one or the other. But a Bumblebee who could speak to humans without the radio montage and the laborious gesture and the gap where direct communication should have been, was something the Autobot command structure had not planned around, and the distance between what they had built their strategy for and what they now had was wide enough to change the shape of things. The first change was the human situation. The Autobots had been working with a small group of military liaisons for 8 months, a relationship built on necessity and sustained by Optimus Prime's careful, deliberate courtesy, the kind of courtesy that communicated genuine respect for beings he did not fully understand, which the humans received in roughly equal parts as warmth and profound alien strangeness. The relationship worked. It worked the way things work when both parties are trying hard enough to compensate for everything they lack, and it had produced real results shared intelligence, coordinated responses to 3 Decepticon strikes, a communication infrastructure that had saved lives on both sides of the species divide. But it had a ceiling, and the ceiling was built from everything that could not be said directly, every nuance that got lost in the translation between Cybertronian strategic logic and human operational thinking, every piece of context that required 5 minutes to establish and could not be established in the field. Bumblebee did not replace this relationship. He translated it. He had been listening to how humans talked for longer than any other Autobot on Earth, cataloging the registers and codes of their communication, the specific language of military trust that lived in the gap between formal channels, the way people who were frightened said they were not frightened, the way skepticism looked different from hostility even when both produced the same words. He sat with the liaison team and asked about their families and remembered the answers and asked follow-up questions 3 weeks later. And what this did to the room was something Optimus watched with the careful attention of a commander observing a capability he had not known he was developing. The liaisons who had been professional and correct and productively cooperative became something else. They became genuinely allied, not with the Autobots as a concept or a strategic asset, but with this specific yellow Autobot who remembered their children's names and their bad days and who spoke to them like they were the only beings in the room that mattered. The second change was the intelligence operation. The transmissions Bumblebee had recorded the night the shot missed were only the surface of something larger. And once Optimus Prime had assembled every analyst in a closed briefing and played the recordings through, the room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone has heard the same catastrophe and is deciding in real time what it means. The recordings documented a communication network between the Decepticon command structure and a set of human contact points, not hostile civilians, not reluctant collaborators, but active, willing partners who had been receiving information and providing something in return, and what they were providing was access, security clearances, facility coordinates. The kind of access that would let a Decepticon strike team walk into 3 separate military installations and leave nothing standing. Optimus Prime gave Bumblebee a new assignment that same morning. He did not frame it as dangerous. Bumblebee did not ask him to. The 4 months that followed were the months Bumblebee would later think of as the ones where he understood what his voice was actually for, which was not celebration or command, but the slow, difficult work of making 2 different kinds of beings trust each other enough to coordinate when it mattered. The human liaison program expanded. The Autobots had never had a public face before, not in the way that public face needed to work with a human population that was frightened and understandably resistant to the idea that their planet had become a battlefield in someone else's war. Bumblebee became the public face, not because anyone decided he should, but because he was the one. Standing in the right place, saying exactly the right thing. And the right thing turned out to be the truth, delivered at a speed humans could track, in a register that communicated genuine concern without condescension and genuine urgency without panic. He briefed the Human Defense Council 7 times in those 4 months. He met with the liaison team 3 times a week. He established communication protocols that the Autobots had never needed before, because they had never had an interface capable of explaining Cybertronian strategic logic in terms that closed the gap rather than widened it. And in the background of all of this, running parallel to everything visible, he continued the intelligence work, extending the frequency sweep that had begun that night in Nevada, building a map of the Decepticon communication network that no one else in the Autobot structure had the patience or the operational range to construct. What Ratchet noticed? Because Ratchet noticed everything and committed most of it to formal documentation, was that Bumblebee was running hotter than his specifications were designed to sustain, that his rest cycles were shorter than recommended and getting shorter, that the particular kind of operational strain he was carrying was the kind that did not resolve on its own but accumulated in ways that became visible only after the accumulation crossed a threshold. The Scout dismissed this with the cheerful precision he used to make efficiency sound like enthusiasm, but Ratchet flagged it anyway. And Optimus Prime read it and said nothing directly to Bumblebee and watched the coalition grow instead, watched the way human beings who had been skeptical and frightened began to treat this small yellow Autobot with something that looked, from the outside, like genuine affection, and he understood that what Bumblebee was doing was the kind of work that could not be ordered. It had to come from within the being doing it, from the genuine desire to be understood and to understand, and the voice that made it possible was not just a communication tool. It was proof of something that Optimus had been trying to demonstrate through his own careful courtesy for 8 months and had not yet fully succeeded in demonstrating, that the Autobots were not simply another faction in the war, but beings who could be trusted with the things that mattered. Soundwave was not a being who made the same mistake twice. He filed the miss at the water treatment facility not as a failure but as a variable that had changed the operational landscape in ways that had not yet finished changing, and he tracked those changes with the patience of a system built to process information across timescales that made human strategic planning look like noise. The intercept campaign he designed over the weeks that followed was not designed to destroy Bumblebee. Destruction would have been simpler and less useful. What Soundwave needed was the extent of the map the Scout was building, specifically the question of how much the network reconstruction had progressed, and whether it had already identified the contact architecture that Megatron's arrangement depended on. The campaign began with false signals. Soundwave seeded the frequency bands Bumblebee monitored with authentic-seeming traffic that led to deliberately empty locations, testing the Scout's filtering methodology by observing which signals he followed and which he dismissed. 11 days of this produced a finding that Soundwave registered with something that would have been respect in a less disciplined system, which was that Bumblebee's filtering algorithms were significantly better than the operational intelligence had credited them. The campaign shifted. The Decepticon strike on the Eastern Communications Relay 2 weeks later was not designed to succeed. It was designed to force Bumblebee to activate the broadcast protocols he had been developing, to expose the shape of his network by making him use it under pressure, and to give Soundwave 40 seconds of open frequency to analyze. Ironhide and Sideswipe repelled the strike, which was expected, and Bumblebee coordinated the defense through a channel that Soundwave had spent 3 days positioning collection architecture to reach, and what the 41 seconds of open frequency before encryption revealed was not the map itself, but the confirmation that the map was real, that it extended further than Decepticon Command had estimated, and that the Scout had built something during those 4 months of coalition work that the standard Decepticon operational playbook had no category for. Megatron received Soundwave's analysis the same day. He read it twice, and then he made a decision that changed the war's timeline in ways neither side would fully understand for months. The transmission that broke everything open came on a Tuesday at 2 in the morning in the time zone where Bumblebee happened to be parked outside a motel on the edge of Phoenix, running passive collection on the third human contact on his network reconstruction, a contact he had identified through pattern analysis as the most likely point of origin for the Decepticon access to the liaison infrastructure. He had been in position for 6 hours when the frequency band he had flagged 3 months earlier as potentially significant came alive with a channel that was not routed through the standard Decepticon relay architecture. It was cleaner, older. Using an encoding schema he almost did not recognize because he had encountered it only twice before in Autobot archives as a fragment of a communication format that predated the war on Cybertron by a span of time that made the current conflict look recent. He recorded it. He said nothing to no one and drove 40 miles east to a rest stop and spent 3 hours processing what he had received, running the decryption against every key in his database, checking and rechecking, arriving at the same translation each time. And then he sat very still in his vehicle form in the desert while the sky shifted from black to dark blue, and he understood what he was carrying. The transmission confirmed an ongoing negotiation that had been running for 5 months. Megatron's offer was specific: a package of Cybertronian energy conversion technology that would solve 3 of the most persistent problems in human power infrastructure, offered freely, with technical assistance, with long-term maintenance and training, the kind of generosity that would make the offering party indispensable to the receiving party before the receiving party understood what it was. Receiving. What the receiving party, a covert faction of military and corporate leadership whose names the transmission listed in full, was providing in exchange was specific. The coordinates of every Autobot facility on Earth, updated in real time through the access they had built inside the liaison network Bumblebee had spent 4 months constructing. The timeline was 31 days. In 31 days, the updated coordinates would be delivered, and 12 hours after that, a Decepticon strike force of a scale the Autobots had never faced on this planet would arrive at every location simultaneously. The war would end in a morning that no Autobot on Earth would survive to see the afternoon of. Bumblebee drove back into Phoenix as the sun came up and bought a coffee from a drive-through window and sat in a parking lot holding it, which he could not drink but held anyway, and thought about what his voice was for. The crisis was not tactical. It was not something that could be resolved by applying force to the right location, not something that Ironhide or Sideswipe or even Optimus Prime with his full authority and his millions of years of command experience could address directly, because the crisis lived inside the structure they had built, inside the coalition that was both their greatest strategic advantage and the specific mechanism through which their destruction had been purchased. If he brought the transmission to Optimus Prime with the full documentation of who had been compromised and how the Decepticon contacts inside the human network had been established, the coalition would fracture. The humans who had not been compromised and there were many, would be caught inside an investigation that would consume the trust they had built, slow it, damage it in ways that took years to repair even under ideal conditions. The humans who had been compromised would be exposed, and the questions about their motivations, questions that the transmissions suggested were not simple, would become the story of the Coalition instead of everything the Coalition had accomplished and everything it still needed to do. The Decepticons would have achieved through disclosure what they had failed to achieve through attack. If he did not bring it to Optimus Prime, and instead manage the intelligence alone, the 31 days would run out in ways he could not fully control, because the Decepticons were already moving, already assembling the strike force, already operating on the assumption that the coordinates would be delivered on schedule, and a single Autobot scout could not counter a simultaneous multi-site assault on his own. And asking for help meant explaining what he knew, which produced the same fracture, just with less time to survive it. Bumblebee spent 2 days not sleeping and running every calculation and arriving at the same place from every approach. There was no version of this where the truth was clean. There was no version where the voice he had been given, the voice that had been given back to him in a misfired pulse in the Nevada dark, could say the words that needed to be said without breaking the thing those words were trying to save. He went to Optimus Prime on the 3rd day. Optimus Prime listened to the full recording without moving. Bumblebee had told him before he played it that he needed to be still for the duration, had explained why. Because even the small involuntary responses Optimus made when processing arrived at a conclusion were going to be a distraction from what needed to be heard whole. And Optimus had accepted this with the gravity of a commander who understood that being told how to receive information was sometimes the most important intelligence of all. He listened, he processed. He sat in the silence that Bumblebee had learned to read as the largest mind in the room doing its hardest work. Then Optimus said, "Tell me what you think we should do." Bumblebee had not expected this question, and he said so, and Optimus said something that Bumblebee would repeat twice more across his operational lifetime, once in a briefing, 15 years after that morning, and once to a young Autobot who needed to hear it more than they needed almost anything else. That the being who carries the intelligence is almost always better positioned to understand its implications than the being who receives it, because understanding comes from the carrying, not the hearing, and Bumblebee had been carrying this for 2 days and had emerged with something worth saying. He told Optimus what he thought. He told him in the careful, specific register he used when the stakes made him most precise, which sounded nothing like enthusiasm and nothing like fear, but carried both of them threaded through each sentence. He said they could not protect the Coalition by protecting it from the truth. He said that what Megatron had found in the human network was not a flaw in the Coalition, but a proof of it, because what the Decepticons had understood was that the Coalition was powerful enough to be worth corrupting, and the specific nature of what they had offered, which was not violence but technology, not conquest but partnership, suggested that the humans who had agreed were not traitors in any simple sense, but beings caught between competing goods in a conflict that was not theirs to begin with, that had come to their planet from outside and would continue regardless of what any one of them chose. He said that he thought they had 29 days remaining and that how they used those 29 days would determine whether the Autobot presence on Earth survived the war or survived only the battle. Optimus Prime asked one more question, whether Bumblebee was willing to be the one who delivered the information to the human side. Bumblebee said yes before the question was finished. The next 12 days were the most operationally precise work he had ever done and the most personally costly, and neither fact was separable from the other. The plan Optimus Prime approved was not a disclosure plan. It was a replacement plan, a method for extracting the compromised contacts from positions where they could deliver real coordinates, substituting the Decepticon intelligence feed with corrupted data that would send a strike force to empty terrain, and doing all of it in a window that had to close before the Decepticons ran a verification check and understood what was happening. The window was narrow, the timing had no margin, and every moving part of it depended on 4 human beings making a choice that no strategic calculation could guarantee. Bumblebee met each of them personally, not through the official liaison channels, in person, in the places they felt safest, because you had to meet someone in their safety to tell them something that was going to take it away. The meetings were the hardest things he had ever done with his voice, harder than the briefings in the Coalition building and the night he had run from Soundwave, because each of these 4 human beings had made a choice that was going to cost them something, and he had to sit with that and not look away from it while simultaneously giving them a path that did not end in the worst possible version of what they were living. What he found in those meetings was not what he had expected. He had expected calculation, the specific logic of beings who had weighed 2 sides and chosen the one that seemed more likely to win. What he found was more complicated and more human, which was to say, it was entangled in the way human things were entangled, in fear and exhaustion, and the specific desperation of people who had been watching an alien war tear through the world they were responsible for, protecting and had not been able to stop any of it. Megatron had offered them something that looked like a way out. Not safety, not peace, but agency. The specific kind of agency that comes from being on the side that wins before the winning is visible to anyone else, from having made the choice that allowed your people to survive, even if the choice required a particular kind of silence about its price. He did not excuse it, he did not condemn it in the language of betrayal, because betrayal required an allegiance freely given and fully informed, and the allegiance the Coalition had asked of these four had come at a cost that no one had been honest about, the cost of being caught inside a war between beings of incomprehensible power and having the survival of everyone you cared about depend on choices that none of the available options made clean. He told them the truth, that the strike Megatron was planning would not spare them, that the technology he had offered was contingent on a Decepticon victory that had never been genuinely on offer for the human side, that they had been used, and that what they chose to do with the next 17 days would determine which version of themselves they would carry for the rest of their lives. 3 of them chose correctly. They pulled the access, they fed the corrupted coordinates, they chose, at significant personal cost, to be the mechanism by which a plan designed to destroy everything the Coalition had become was turned into empty terrain and wasted fuel. The 4th, whose name Bumblebee reported in full to Optimus Prime and who was quietly removed from the Coalition, had not been able to make the choice, could not find the version of themselves capable of it, and Bumblebee drove away from that meeting in the pre-dawn dark and said nothing for 6 hours, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much, and none of it was going to help. The Decepticon strike force that arrived on the 31st day found nothing. 12 simultaneous approach vectors converging on coordinates that held no Autobots, no technology, no presence worth the energy expenditure of reaching them. The 12 seconds it took for Soundwave to process the 12 simultaneous streams of empty terrain were 12 seconds in which the entire operational structure of 5 months of careful Decepticon preparation became weight with nowhere to land. Megatron did not respond with disorder. He had never been a commander who responded to tactical failure with disorder. He was wrong, in the deepest possible ways, about what he was fighting for and who deserved to lose, but he was not irrational, and his response was not anger but adjustment, the specific kind of adjustment that a mind like his made when a strategy had failed at the foundation, which was to return to first principles and ask what had been miscalculated. What Soundwave's analysis produced, within 4 minutes of the failed strike, was a finding Megatron had not anticipated. The network correction had been executed from inside the Coalition infrastructure by a being who had understood the full scope of the operation and had the specific operational capability to reach each of the 4 human contacts before they could complete the delivery. The vocal processor characteristics of the correction coordination matched only one profile in the Decepticon intelligence database, and Soundwave had been tracking that profile for 8 months. The Scout had been running an operation that the standard Decepticon playbook had no framework for, something built not on force or coercion or the leverage that came from having better weapons, but on genuine communication across a gap that most beings in the war had decided was too wide to bridge. Soundwave filed this under the category of things that change what the war was, not just how it was being fought. Megatron received the analysis and went quiet in the way he went quiet when something had shifted his understanding of the stakes, and then he ordered a withdrawal from 3 of the 6 operational theaters the Decepticons had been pressing, a contraction that gave the Autobots ground and time they had not planned to receive, and that no Autobot strategist, including Optimus Prime, had predicted. The Coalition survived the disclosure. It did not survive it cleanly, and Bumblebee had known it would not, had factored that knowledge into every meeting with those 4 human beings, and had said so to Optimus Prime when Optimus asked what the aftermath would look like. The full accounting came in the form he had recommended, which was a complete disclosure to the full liaison group with all documentation and the 3 reclaimed contacts present to speak for themselves, and what a full accounting always does to a group of beings operating on trust is show them exactly how much the trust has cost and leave them with the decision about whether it is still worth the price. The repair took 3 months. It was not a perfect repair. The 4th contact's removal remained a wound everyone felt and no one addressed directly in the official channels, and the knowledge that Megatron had found a way inside the Coalition's human infrastructure once would always be present in how the Coalition operated afterward, a permanent adjustment in the level of verification applied to intelligence that moved through it, a wariness that lived just below the surface of every working relationship in the structure. This was not a failure of the Coalition. This was what trust looked like after it had been tested at the worst possible angle and had survived the test, heavier and more careful and knowing exactly what it was carrying. Bumblebee did not sleep well for a long time after. Ratchet documented this in 3 consecutive maintenance reports. Optimus Prime read all 3 and said nothing directly, and then one evening came to sit with Bumblebee in the facility garage and was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke it was not about the intelligence operation or the fourth contact or the strategic implications of the Decepticon withdrawal. He told Bumblebee about Cybertron. He told him about what it had felt like to speak to Megatron as a friend before any of this, in the time when the war was still only an argument, and the argument was still something that might resolve without becoming what it became. He told him about the specific quality of silence that fell between them when the war began. The silence that was not the absence of communication, but the presence of something that could not be said, a grief that had no language because the language it needed had not yet been invented by either of them, because grief for something that is happening while you are still inside it is different from grief for something finished, and this grief had not finished. He told Bumblebee that the voice was not a gift that protected you from loss. It was a tool that let you carry loss in a way that other beings could see and understand, and carrying it that way, making it visible and legible to the world outside yourself, was the hardest thing you could do with it and the most necessary. Bumblebee listened without speaking, and then he said, "I know. The Decepticon withdrawal from the 3 theaters was not permanent, and the Autobots had enough operational experience to understand that a Megatron who was contracting was recalculating, which was in certain ways more dangerous than a Megatron who was pressing, because a recalculating Megatron was a Megatron who had decided the current approach was wrong and was building a different one. The intelligence operation Bumblebee ran over the following 18 months was the most comprehensive the Autobots had ever mounted on Earth, because the Coalition gave them access to communication infrastructure that no previous Autobot operation had been positioned to leverage, and because Bumblebee had spent enough time inside the huge side of that infrastructure to understand how to move through it without generating the kind of friction that produced signal noise, what changed was not the war's existence. The Decepticons did not stop fighting, neither did the Autobots. But the specific geometry of the conflict shifted in ways that both sides recognized as something that could not be undone, because the Decepticons had lost the possibility of a single decisive strike that would end the Autobot presence on Earth, and the Autobots had lost the naivety of believing that the human coalition was a stable structure requiring only courtesy and goodwill to maintain. Both sides were now in a war that was going to be longer and more complicated and conducted at a lower temperature than either had been fighting before, and that was a different kind of war, one that would be won or lost not in a morning of coordinated strikes, but in the accumulated weight of every choice made in the quiet spaces between engagements. In the middle of this, Bumblebee continued to work. He ran intelligence operations. He briefed the Coalition. He met with human liaisons, old and new, and continued the patient, necessary labor of building trust across a gap that was never going to close entirely. He recorded transmissions and analyzed frequency patterns, and identified over the course of many months a slow shift in Soundwave's collection strategy, from one designed to intercept, exploit, to one that seemed, if he was reading it correctly, designed to understand. This he found genuinely interesting, in the same way you found a thing interesting when it suggested that something you had assumed was fixed was not fixed after all. He flagged it for Optimus Prime. He presented the data without speculation, because he had learned that the voice was most useful when it carried things accurately, without the distortions that came from wanting a particular interpretation to be true. Say the thing. Say it exactly. Let the one receiving it do the work that only they could do. There was a morning, not significant by any tactical measure, no engagement that day, no intelligence acquisition of note, just a desert sunrise burning orange over the Nevada scrubland, while the base was quiet in the way it was quiet, when nothing was immediately about to happen, when Bumblebee stood outside and watched the light come and understood something he had been moving toward for a long time without being able to name it. The war was not going to end the way wars and stories ended. There was not going to be a final battle, a single decisive moment, a day when the frequencies went quiet and stayed quiet. The war was going to change and change again, and the shape of it was going to be determined not by the largest weapons or the most powerful commanders, but by the accumulated weight of every choice made in the quiet moments, every conversation that built something that had not existed before, every transmission accurately recorded and honestly reported, every meeting in a parking lot at 2 in the morning where a being who had almost been silenced chose to speak anyway and was heard. He thought about Soundwave's shot. He thought about it regularly, the way you return to the things that had almost happened, the specific geometry of the miss, the crumbling wall, and the deflected pulse, and the single instant where the war's entire mathematics shifted on an Axis too small to have been planned for by either side. He had spent a long time being careful not to think about what it meant, because the version where the shot landed was a version he had no access to and no obligation to carry, and the voice he had been given back that night had taught him that carrying weight you had not been given was the fastest way to become unable to carry the weight that was actually yours. But that morning he let himself think about it. He let himself feel the weight of the parallel timeline, the one where Soundwave's aim was true, where the Autobots scout who came back to base was different, was smaller in a way that had nothing to do with size, was doing his job as well as anyone could do it, but without the specific tool that had let him build what he had built, the coalition, the network, the 4 meetings in the dark, and the 3 choices that turned empty terrain, and the one that had not been possible, and the grief he still carried from it. He thought about what the war looked like from inside that other timeline. He thought about the morning that was coming in that timeline from 31 days of coordinates, and he let himself feel the full weight of what had been averted. Then the sun was fully up, and Ratchet was broadcasting on the internal channel, which he did every morning as a kind of announcement that the day had begun, and the living were still living, and there was work to do, and Bumblebee turned away from the desert and walked back inside. He said, "Good morning." He said it in his own voice, the only voice he had ever had, the voice that had been aimed for and missed, the voice that had built a coalition and delivered a warning and carried the weight of the things that needed to be said, and the heavier weight of the things that could not be said cleanly and had to be carried anyway. The voice that had been almost taken and had remained, and had become the instrument through which an age of open war quietly learned what it was. Going to cost to end, the war went on, the coalition held, and the scout who had always been good at running learned in the end that the most important thing he had ever done was stay.